Have you ever watched someone smile while taking everything you built and wondered if they even understood the cost? The room was glass-walled, filled with polished wood and polished people. I stood there, freshly dismissed, while my younger cousin, Victoria, now the newly crowned CEO of St. James Capital, barely looked up from her notes. "Effective immediately, your role is no longer essential to our future vision," she said, with the practiced cool of someone delivering a forecast. Not a firing. There were no questions, no discussions, just her voice echoing slightly across the long boardroom table. I glanced around. A few executives avoided eye contact, a few looked almost relieved, and the rest just waited for the moment to be over. 20 years. I'd overseen municipal acquisitions, closed 9-figure property deals, negotiated with city governments and international lenders. And yet, there I was, handed a clean severance envelope and replaced by a consultant with a TED Talk and a venture capital podcast. I picked up my briefcase. I smiled at Victoria, and I walked out, silent. What she didn't know, what no one in that room seemed to realize, was that the ground beneath their most profitable towers didn't belong to the company. It belonged to me. Long before boardrooms and buzzwords, there was a cramped second-floor office above a shuttered textile mill in New Haven. That's where my grandfather started St. James Capital, and where I started too, at 17, spending weekends sorting paper leases and watching him scribble numbers in the margins of legal pads. He believed in property, not profit margins. Own the land, he'd tell me. Everything else is cosmetic. I never wanted a title. I wanted to build something that would outlast the people who tried to take credit for it. While Victoria shadowed our grandfather on press tours and ribbon cuttings, I was out with building inspectors, town clerks, zoning officers. I learned where deals were actually made, at late dinners with city planners, not in morning strategy decks. By the time I was 28, I'd structured the firm's largest land bank deal, acquiring 6 blocks of underused waterfront real estate that would become the spine of our Connecticut portfolio. Victoria, on the other hand, went to Wharton, returned with sleek suits and shinier ideas. She became the face of our brand. Elegant, articulate, perfectly media-trained. She could charm a round table of hedge fund managers in 5 minutes flat. And in fairness, it worked. She brought in press. Capital followed. Our firm became a case study in modern reinvention. But while she was drawing admiration from Forbes and Fast Company, I was solving the invisible problems. Aging infrastructure, legacy tenants, regulatory minefields. I worked with local unions, calmed angry neighborhood groups, negotiated with public transit officials when one of our developments threatened to encroach on a historic streetcar line. I wasn't flashy, but I was necessary. At first, the balance worked. She played the spotlight and I handled the shadows. We respected each other in our own way, but something shifted when our grandfather passed, his will named Victoria CEO. I wasn't surprised. She was, after all, the more visible of the two of us. But what he left me was quieter, more intentional. A private envelope, delivered by his lawyer. Inside, one line handwritten beneath the firm's original charter. Don't let them sell the foundation. At first, I didn't understand. But as I read through the rest of his notes, documents he'd kept to himself, I realized he had known something was coming. He'd seen how Victoria admired acceleration over sustainability, headlines over balance sheets. He warned that short-term growth would tempt the next generation to sell what he called the skeleton of the company, its most irreplaceable assets. He'd spent years helping me prepare without ever saying it outright. Every time he let me lead a quiet deal, every time he pushed me to walk properties on foot instead of just running numbers, he had been building my education, not in spreadsheets, but in structure. He knew that in the modern world of asset-light, strategy and digital portfolios, people would eventually forget the value of actual land, of owning the space others rent, so I started acquiring it, quietly. Under a separate legal entity, I began purchasing parcels our company operated on but didn't own. I didn't do it for power. I did it because I saw the cracks forming in the way Victoria and her cohort approached the business. They wanted speed, I built slow. Now, as I left that boardroom behind me, I thought about my grandfather's words. The others believed they'd cut me loose from the company, but what they hadn't noticed, what they'd never bothered to ask, was that the foundation they were all standing on had quietly shifted, and I was the one holding it together. It didn't take long for the shape of Victoria's plan to come into focus. She moved quickly after my departure, too quickly for someone who was simply streamlining operations. Within days, I heard from former colleagues that long-standing vendors were being dropped, leases reviewed, historic buildings quietly appraised. There was no transition period, no audit of my work, just a swift sweep of anything that bore my fingerprint. That alone might have been business as usual, a new leader marking territory, but the patterns went deeper. Certain properties, specifically our heritage sites in Providence, New Haven, and South Boston, were suddenly undergoing valuation reviews. These weren't the sort of properties we flipped. They were keystones of our reputation, the kind of buildings featured in our founding brochures and investor prospectuses. The question was, why now? I had a hunch. I asked my attorney to discreetly search for new filings in state records, and within 48 hours, she called back with a tone I hadn't heard from her before. Measured, but sharp. She's planning something big, Patricia said. There's a holding company registered under a different name, Aurora Visions LLC. Delaware-based, no public links to St. James Capital, but the managing member is Victoria, under her married name. A married name most people in the industry barely remembered. It was a ghost identity used only in legal documents. That alone was telling. Aurora Visions had already filed 3 development permits in the same cities where our firm's landmark building stood. Each application mentioned high-end urban retreats, tech-integrated hospitality centers designed for a younger, affluent demographic. These weren't diversifications. They were direct competitors to St. James Capital's existing properties. Even more damning, in one of the filings, Aurora referenced leveraging insider market insights and pre-established supply chains, which could only mean she intended to use resources built inside our company to accelerate her personal empire. It was clearer than ever. I hadn't been removed because I was outdated or unnecessary. I was removed because I was an obstacle. My continued presence threatened the execution of her real plan, to gut the soul of St. James Capital, strip away its history, and rebuild something shinier in its place, something she controlled completely and solely. To the outside world, it would look like innovation. Victoria St. James, the next-gen CEO, transforming an old-world investment firm into a tech-forward hospitality powerhouse. But I knew better. This wasn't strategy. It was theft with a vision statement. Still, I stayed quiet. No emails, no leaks. I simply watched as she moved the chess pieces, believing no one saw the full board. She reorganized the leadership team, elevating outsiders with glossy resumes but no roots in our cities or properties. Longtime property managers were reassigned, their influence diminished. Staff layoffs were issued under the banner of efficiency. She even gave an interview to a finance podcast, speaking in glowing terms about legacy adaptation and the need to move beyond the emotional weight of tradition. The host laughed. Victoria laughed louder. Sometimes sentiment holds us back, she said. We're building for the future, not polishing the past. I remember replaying that clip alone in my study, fingers steepled beneath my chin. That was her philosophy in one sentence. And in that sentence, I saw the danger not just to me, but to everyone who had made this company their life's work. She wasn't planning to evolve St. James Capital. She was planning to cannibalize it. And, all the while, she had no idea that the ground beneath her glittering hotels, her consultants, her quarterly optimism, was borrowed. And that lease? It was about to expire. I never believed in reacting out of anger. Emotion makes you sloppy. And when you're up against someone who only sees in straight lines, growth, speed, expansion, you learn to think in layers, to plan beneath the surface. That's why, 6 years before Victoria ever dreamed of becoming CEO, I started laying the groundwork for something quieter, slower, and infinitely harder to dismantle. Back then, during a routine audit of our portfolio, I'd noticed something that didn't sit right. 3 of our most valuable properties, Providence Central, the Ridgemont in South Boston, and the historic New Haven Exchange, were operating on leased land. The leases had been signed decades ago, back when my grandfather was still wheeling and dealing handshakes more than contracts. The terms were generous, even naive by today's standards. 99 years, flat rate rent, limited, renewal restrictions. At the time, it made sense. It allowed the firm to scale quickly without heavy upfront capital. But now those leases were nearing a critical inflection point. Not the end, but the 5-year review clause. A quiet little clause that allowed for reassessment of rental rates and landlord terms. The original owners had either passed away or aged out of relevance. Their heirs were mostly distant, scattered, and increasingly uninterested in managing inherited real estate. So I made them offers. Not through St. James Capital. That would have raised flags. Instead, I created a private investment vehicle, East Alder Holdings, registered out of Vermont, no ties to our family name. I worked with local attorneys, made fair private proposals, and within 18 months I owned the land beneath all 3 buildings. I didn't make a show of it. I didn't change the signage or adjust rent rates. I simply continued the existing lease agreements as is, drafting new 5-year extensions with terms that heavily favored St. James Capital. I didn't do it for leverage, at least not then. I did it because I understood what Victoria didn't. Long-term security isn't about brand buzz or Instagram-ready lobbies. It's about owning what no one else sees. Foundation. To her credit, she never once questioned the leases. I left breadcrumbs in our records, filings, summaries, lease references, but she had always preferred glossy overview decks to dense operational reports. She saw metrics, not mechanisms. And now those 5-year extensions were reaching their renewal point. I had already met with my legal team, mapped out proposed new terms. The sweetheart deals I'd offered previously had saved the company nearly $8 million across the 3 properties. But that discount had run its course. Market rates were climbing, construction costs were up, and Aurora Visions LLC had just submitted development permits within blocks of my properties. That changed everything. By law, I was obligated to notify the tenant, St. James Capital, of the upcoming lease renewals 60 days in advance. And I would. But this time, there would be no favors. No extensions on grace periods, no below-market arrangements, just clean, competitive terms. Take it or leave it. The math wasn't in her favor. If Victoria accepted the new leases, she'd have to explain a sudden spike in fixed operational costs to the board. If she refused, she'd have to relocate or sell. Either way, it would shatter her expansion plan. Still, I wasn't celebrating. There was no joy in what was coming. Just a cold, steady awareness that I'd done the work, that I'd built my defense not with anger, but with patience. As I stood on the rooftop terrace of the Ridgemont that evening, watching the city lights flicker against the harbor, I realized something else. Victoria had inherited power. I had built position. And in the long game, those 2 things were not the same. The first signs of collapse didn't come with headlines or lawsuits. They came with whispers. It started with a call from Jared, the longtime property manager at the Ridgemont. We hadn't spoken since I was dismissed. His voice was quiet but urgent. "The new team's slashing preventive maintenance," he said. "They're using generic HVAC filters and skipping quarterly inspections. We just had a near fire from an overloaded sub-panel. They don't understand how this place works." I listened, offered no advice, and reminded him I was no longer with the company. Still, I wrote down what he said. Then came the messages from other staff, some subtle, some blunt. The head concierge at Providence Central emailed me a photo of a guest complaint log, 4 pages in a single week. One guest found mold in a bathroom. Another slipped on an unmarked spill in the lobby. In another message, the chef at the New Haven Exchange told me they'd cut the breakfast budget by 30% and fired 2 sous chefs without warning. Victoria's consultant, A tall, self-congratulatory man from San Francisco named Nolan had swept in with his cost reduction playbook and a grin full of buzzwords. Efficiency, he called it. Streamlined hospitality. But to the people who actually ran those properties, it felt like sabotage. And to the guests, it felt like indifference. Online reviews began to reflect that shift. Star ratings dipped. Former loyalists posted long emotional critiques about how something had changed. A few posts went semi-viral on local travel blogs, with commenters lamenting how St. James used to care. I said nothing. I made no calls. Karma was doing the talking for me. Behind the scenes, Victoria was beginning to feel the ripple effects. She called a company-wide Zoom to reaffirm strategic alignment. The background was perfect. Modern artwork, soft focus lighting, but her tone was clipped. She talked about transformational periods and short-term disruption in service perception, but her eyes gave her away. They darted at her notes. Her jaw tightened at every staff question. She was losing control of the story. Then came the insurance audit. Unrelated, or so it seemed at first. A routine update to property coverage had flagged a discrepancy in ownership. The land beneath the Ridgemont was no longer listed as corporate held. Neither was Providence Central or New Haven Exchange. That's when the emails started to fly. Internal legal flagged the leases, and someone finally read the documents carefully. They traced the lease agreements back to East Alder Holdings, and noticed the name attached to the original signatures, Ethan C. St. James. I wasn't hiding. I had signed my name clearly. I just never broadcasted it. That same week, a third-party vendor reached out, one of our old security contractors. He'd been approached by Aurora Visions LLC to bid on surveillance systems for 3 proposed new developments in the exact cities where our flagship building stood. When I asked him who attended the planning meeting, he hesitated. Victoria, he finally said. She didn't introduce herself, but it was her. It all clicked. While she was bleeding the company from within, understaffing, cutting quality, alienating her team, she was simultaneously preparing her new company to rise from the ruins. Aurora Visions wasn't just a backup plan. It was the goal all along. Gut St. James, force it into retreat, then acquire or replace its key properties under a new name, free from family ties or board oversight. She thought it would be easy. She never anticipated that the land itself wouldn't cooperate. 2 days later, I received a formal inquiry from St. James Capital's in-house counsel requesting a meeting to clarify certain lease terms. The tone was stiff, corporate, and a little nervous. I declined the meeting. Instead, I sent my own notice. 60 days. That's how long they had before the lease renewals on all 3 properties would trigger. And this time, there would be no preferential treatment. The foundation she had built her empire on was shifting beneath her feet. And now, for the first time, she was the one scrambling for solid ground. Victoria's response to the lease renewal notice was swifter than I expected, but also more desperate. Within 24 hours, her legal team submitted a formal objection, claiming the increases were unjustified and commercially predatory. I expected the posturing. What I didn't expect was the tone of the letter, aggressive, defensive, and riddled with assumptions. They clearly hadn't grasped the full scope of my position. They still thought this was a negotiation. It wasn't. Patricia, my attorney, drafted a calm but firm response. She laid out the legal foundation, every contract clause, every statutory requirement, every notification met on time and in writing. She attached a comparison of current market rates across equivalent properties in the same zones. Then she added a final note. Any further communication may be directed to Mr. St. James's representatives at East Alder Holdings. It was the first time Victoria saw my name formally attached to the counterposition. From that moment, the story started to unravel. Behind closed doors, the board began asking questions, ones Victoria couldn't answer. Why hadn't they known about the lease terms expiring? Why hadn't the CEO disclosed that 3 of their flagship properties were sitting on land leased from her own cousin? And how exactly had she allowed that oversight while simultaneously Preparing Aurora Visions to compete in those exact markets? One of the more independent board members, Leland Carter, quietly reached out to me. He'd always been a pragmatist, one of the few who didn't buy into Victoria's flash and flare strategy, but had remained loyal for the sake of continuity. He didn't mince words. "She's in trouble," he said. "They've started reviewing internal emails. There's a trail of communications between her and Aurora's leadership team, some of them time-stamped during company hours. She used St. James Capital's own resources to shop vendors for Aurora. That, legally, was exposure, conflict of interest, breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of company assets, but it got worse. Patricia uncovered public records that tied Aurora Visions not just to Victoria's personal trust fund, but to a shadow LLC based in Luxembourg, a tax shelter her husband had once used during his time as an energy consultant. Through that shell company, Aurora had been quietly acquiring zoning permits adjacent to our properties. The intention was clear: force St. James Capital into a liquidity crisis by inflating their cost base, then sweep in to purchase either the buildings or the customer base outright. Classic bait and collapse. Except she forgot one thing: the foundation wasn't hers. When word got back to me that she was planning an emergency board meeting to renegotiate the leases, I knew it was time to act. I compiled a packet, simple, unadorned, but devastating in its clarity. It included all 3 lease agreements, properly filed and time-stamped, my communications showing full compliance with legal terms, a breakdown of Aurora Visions, permit applications matching St. James Capital territories, a memo titled Strategic Conflict Risk Internal Competitor Activity, written by Patricia, and finally 2 internal emails, leaked not by me, but likely by someone close to the legal team, in which Victoria referred to St. James's older properties as obsolete assets and ripe for reinvention once the dust settles. The arrogance was astounding. She didn't just plan to replace the company. She intended to dismantle it and then resurrect its legacy under her personal banner, and she thought no one would stop her. When I sent the packet to the board, confidentially through Leland, they responded with silence. No acknowledgement. No follow-up. Then 3 days later I received a phone call from a number I hadn't dialed in years. It was my uncle, Victoria's father, one of the founding partners of the firm, long retired, now living quietly in Maine. "I've read everything," he said, "and I want you to know, I had no idea what she was doing." His voice cracked slightly. "Will you be attending the board meeting?" "No," I said, "but I'll be watching what happens next." He paused. "For what it's worth, your grandfather would have been proud of the way you handled this." I didn't reply, because this was never about pride. It was about protecting what was real. And now, finally, the illusion was beginning to collapse. The boardroom hadn't changed since the day I was fired. Still encased in glass, still overlooking that narrow stretch of skyline Victoria loved to point to in investor meetings. But the atmosphere inside was different now. Tense, watchful. The kind of silence that comes before a storm, or maybe the aftermath of one. I wasn't sitting at the table this time, but my name was on every document in their hands. Victoria entered, late. No apology, no eye contact. Just that same confident gait, dressed sharper than usual, as if overcompensation could still tip the scales. She took her place at the head of the table and began speaking before the chair officially opened the meeting. "I believe we're all aware of the recent challenges around certain lease renewals," she said crisply. "I'd like to propose we initiate negotiations to bring those terms back to an operationally viable level. Our legal team has flagged irregularities in the original lease acquisition that require investigation. Additionally, I'd like to formally submit a proposal to liquidate underperforming assets, specifically the Providence, South Boston, and New Haven buildings, and reallocate that capital toward high-growth expansion." No one spoke. Then Leland cleared his throat. "Victoria," he said slowly, "before we move to a vote, There are a few things we need clarity on. He nodded toward the folders that sat in front of each board member. I received an external report this week. He continued. It contains documentation showing Aurora Visions LLC, an entity under your personal control, has filed development permits for 3 hospitality properties, in the same locations as the buildings you've just proposed we liquidate. It also outlines your correspondence with vendors while operating as CEO of this firm, and your use of proprietary data for a competing enterprise. The air shifted. Even Victoria flinched. That report was distributed to all board members this morning, Leland added. And as acting chair in the absence of your father, I've called for an executive review of your conduct. Victoria's mask didn't break, but the cracks were visible in her silence. These documents are baseless, she said finally. Sourced from a disgruntled ex-employee. My cousin has made it clear he's been holding a grudge since his removal. Leland turned to me. Ethan, would you like to speak? I stood from the row of chairs behind the board table, my voice calm. I have no desire to return to this firm, I said. But I do expect my legal agreements to be honored. I provided lease terms that are fully in line with the current market. This company has benefited from discounted rates for 5 years. That discount is now over. I paused, then continued. As for my cousin's other venture, the conflict of interest speaks for itself. But I'm not here to litigate character. I'm here to inform the board that Redmont Holdings, a firm you're all familiar with, has expressed interest in acquiring the physical structures of those 3 buildings. They are prepared to meet above-market value, retain all existing staff, and offer transition support. A few board members exchanged looks. Redmont? One of them asked. They've been trying to enter the Northeast market for years. I nodded. This gives them a foothold, and it gives you a clean exit. Victoria's voice sharpened. You've orchestrated this. You've been planning this entire thing, undermining me from the moment I took control. I looked at her, evenly. No, you did that all on your own. I just protected the foundation. You wanted a war, Victoria, but I never fired the first shot. She rose from her seat, lips parted, ready to rebut, when another board member cut in. We've heard. Enough. It was Marian Chen, who had once been Victoria's most loyal supporter. Her tone was dry now, her expression unreadable. We need a vote. What followed was swift. 7 votes for her removal. 1 abstention, from Leland. And 1, surprisingly, from her father, who had entered the room moments before the vote and taken a seat in silence. His abstention wasn't apathy. It was heartbreak. Victoria didn't storm out. She walked slowly this time. Her posture was different. Not broken, but finally aware of gravity. After the meeting, Leland approached me quietly. We'll need interim leadership, he said. Someone who can stabilize morale, at least until we restructure. I shook my head. I'm not interested in rebuilding what she nearly destroyed. My work is elsewhere now. He studied me. Then why come? Today? Why offer Redmont the deal? I glanced back through the glass at the room we'd just left. Because I'm not the one trying to win. I'm the one trying to preserve what still matters. And with that, I left the room. No revenge speech. No triumphant music. Just the sound of consequences catching up. People often mistake power for presence. For who speaks the loudest in the room. Who dominates the headlines, who signs the checks. But real power? It's quiet. It's structural. It's knowing when to step back, and knowing exactly what you still control when you do. Victoria believed that leading meant being seen. She forgot that foundations are often invisible. And when you build without respect for them, the whole thing eventually collapses. I never wanted revenge. I wanted respect. For the people, for the work, for the history we inherited. And maybe most of all, I wanted a future that honored that history, not erased it for the sake of optics. Legacy isn't what your name is printed on. It's what remains, standing after the storm passes. And in the end, that's the difference between building something for applause and building something that lasts. Now I'm curious. What do you think defines real power, in business or in life? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone, and if this story spoke to you even quietly, consider subscribing for more. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones we carry the longest. Until next time, build carefully. The foundation always matters.